For many Europeans, the hardest part of visiting America didn't happen in America, it happened after they went home. The flight landed, the vacation was over, everything was exactly where they had left it. Yet within days, some began noticing a strange and uncomfortable feeling. The country they had spent years criticizing was suddenly occupying their thoughts, and ordinary life back home no longer felt quite as ordinary as it once had. Something had changed in America, but most of them didn't realize it until America was gone. These were visitors who arrived with doubts, stereotypes, and plenty of reasons why Europe did things better. They expected to enjoy the trip, take some pictures, and return home grateful for everything America supposedly lacked. Instead, some returned with heavier suitcases, unexpected habits, and one thought that became increasingly difficult to ignore. I wish I never had to leave. So what did they experience in America that made returning home feel so different? And why are things millions of Americans barely notice every day now the very things these Europeans desperately want back? Join us as we uncover what America gave them that they never expected to miss, and why, for some Europeans, going home was when the real culture shock finally began. For many Europeans returning home from the United States, the first real shock was not losing the enormous portions, the endless convenience, or even the American sunshine. It was returning to a social world that had once felt completely normal and suddenly realizing how quiet it could be. In much of Europe, particularly in larger cities, keeping to yourself is often considered a form of respect. People sit beside each other on trains without speaking, neighbors can pass with little more than a nod, and starting a conversation with a complete stranger may immediately raise the question of what that person wants from you. Walk into a shop, complete your transaction, and leave without exchanging more than a few necessary words, and nobody thinks anything unusual has happened. Then you spend a few weeks in America. Suddenly, the cashier wants to know where your accent comes from. The person behind you in line compliments your shirt. Someone at the next table overhears that you're visiting from Europe and starts recommending places you absolutely have to see before going home. You stop to ask for directions, expecting a 10-second answer, only to find someone pulling out their phone and spending several minutes making sure you don't get lost. For Europeans accustomed to greater social distance, the first reaction can be suspicion. American friendliness is often dismissed from afar as loud, exaggerated, or somehow artificial, while European reserve is more easily interpreted as sophistication and respect for privacy. Yet after experiencing both sides, some visitors begin asking an uncomfortable question: what if the Americans aren't pretending at all? The difference becomes even clearer outside the major tourist centers. In parts of Europe, you can live on the same street for years and barely know the people a few doors away. In America, a visitor can sit on a porch in a small town and find themselves waving at people they have never met, while someone arriving alone at a local gathering may be pulled into a conversation before they have even figured out where to stand. To Americans, much of this is barely worth mentioning. Holding the door, talking to someone in an elevator, helping a confused traveler, or inviting a new acquaintance to join the group can be ordinary social behavior. To a European visitor who arrived expecting Americans to be self-centered and superficial, however, these small encounters can quietly destroy years of assumptions. The real difference is not that Europeans are incapable of kindness or that every American is endlessly friendly. It is that warmth in America often seems to require less permission. You don't always need an introduction, a mutual friend, or a reason to acknowledge another person. Sometimes being in the same place at the same time is enough, and that difference becomes far more noticeable once you go home. After weeks of Americans casually asking about your day, laughing at your accent, offering recommendations, and making you feel strangely included in a country that isn't yours, returning to the familiar reserve of European life can feel unexpectedly cold. The silent train carriage that once represented peace suddenly feels isolating. The cashier who barely looks up is behaving exactly as they always did, yet now something seems to be missing. Even walking through a crowd where everyone carefully avoids everyone else's eyes can make you remember a place thousands of miles away where complete strangers somehow made you feel visible. That may be one of America's most underestimated qualities. Its greatest impression on foreign visitors is not always made by the places that appear on postcards, but by ordinary Americans who will never know they became part of someone else's memory. Europe may have centuries of history, beautiful cities, and a culture built on restraint, but America offers something much harder to photograph: the feeling that the distance between two strangers does not have to remain there. And for some Europeans, it is only after returning to a world where people once again keep their distance that they realize how deeply they had grown attached to a country where a stranger could make them feel at home. One of the strangest things Europeans begin to miss after returning home is something difficult to photograph and almost impossible to pack into a suitcase: the feeling of having options everywhere. In America, choice is so deeply built into everyday life that most Americans barely notice it. Walk into a supermarket and a single product can occupy half an aisle. Order a meal and you can change the ingredients, choose the size, add something that wasn't originally included, or remove almost everything you don't want. Travel to another state and suddenly the stores, restaurants, local products, and even the rhythm of daily life can feel completely different. From the outside, this can look like simple American excess. Why does anyone need dozens of breakfast cereals or an entire wall of hot sauces? Yet after living with that abundance for several weeks, some European visitors begin to understand that there is something deeper behind it. America was built by waves of people arriving from different parts of the world, bringing their own food, habits, businesses, and ideas with them. Over generations, those influences didn't simply remain separate. They competed, mixed, adapted, and created new versions of themselves. That history helps explain why an ordinary American city can offer Mexican food in one neighborhood, Korean barbecue in another, an Italian family restaurant down the road, and a completely new combination of all three somewhere in between. The same mentality extends beyond food. American culture has long placed enormous value on the individual, and businesses learned that giving people more choices was one way to win them over. If customers wanted something different, someone would eventually try to sell it to them. If an inconvenience existed, someone would try to build a service around removing it. That constant competition created some obvious excess, but it also produced something visitors quickly became accustomed to: the expectation that everyday life could adapt to them rather than always requiring them to adapt to it. This is where returning home can feel surprisingly restrictive. Not because Europe lacks quality or variety, but because many Europeans had never realized how quickly they had become accustomed to asking, "What do I want?" instead of simply accepting, "This is what is available." And perhaps that reveals something important about America that tourists don't always understand when they first arrive. The overwhelming supermarkets, endless menus, strange combinations, and seemingly unnecessary options are not separate quirks of American life. They all come from a culture that has spent generations encouraging people to try something different and allowing the market to decide whether the idea survives. Americans themselves may complain about having too many choices, and sometimes they probably do, but for Europeans who temporarily lived inside that system and then left it behind, the absence of those choices could become far more noticeable than they ever expected. They arrived seeing American abundance as excess. They returned home understanding that, underneath all that excess, was something much harder to give up: the freedom to decide for yourself. Some things about America don't seem impressive enough to become travel memories. There are no famous landmarks involved, no breathtaking views, and nothing you would normally photograph to show your friends back home. Yet for many Europeans, these ordinary comforts became some of the hardest things to give up after leaving. It often started with the air conditioning. During the brutal American summer, visitors quickly became accustomed to stepping out of the heat and into a perfectly cooled restaurant, hotel, supermarket, or even gas station. At first, the temperature difference could feel excessive, but after several weeks, walking into that blast of cold air became one of those small pleasures they stopped questioning entirely. Then there was the ice. In America, a cold drink often means a glass packed almost completely with it. Restaurants refill it before you ask. Convenience stores offer cups that seem unnecessarily enormous. And finding something genuinely cold during a hot day requires almost no effort. These details sound trivial until you return home during a European summer and suddenly find yourself staring at two slowly melting ice cubes, wondering when your standards changed. But this was only the beginning of what many visitors discovered about American convenience. America seems to approach everyday problems with one simple question. How can we make this require less effort? Coffee without leaving the car. Food without leaving the car. Banking without leaving the car. Pharmacies designed around convenience. Stores open late into the evening. Enormous parking lots. Clean restrooms along long road trips. And supermarkets where almost everything you might need can be found under one roof. Europeans often joke that Americans are obsessed with convenience. And from the outside, some of it can certainly look excessive. Walking is part of daily life across much of Europe. Stores are often smaller, and people simply adapt to doing things with a little more effort. Yet after experiencing the American version long enough, what once looked like laziness can begin to feel suspiciously like good design. Even an ordinary shopping trip could become part of the attraction. Walking into a Target for one item and leaving an hour later with a cart full of things you never planned to buy became almost a travel ritual, while enormous stores such as Bass Pro Shops could feel less like retail spaces and more like destinations in their own right. None of these conveniences seemed important enough to miss while they were available every day. That changed when they disappeared. Back home, visitors returned to familiar routines and began noticing tiny inconveniences they had never considered inconvenient before. The room felt warmer. The drink wasn't cold enough. The store had already closed. A simple errand required several separate stops. Suddenly, the American habit of making everyday life easier no longer seemed quite so ridiculous. And perhaps that is what America does particularly well. It doesn't always wait for something to become a serious problem before trying to make it more comfortable. Sometimes the goal is simply to save you 10 minutes, keep you cool, give you more choice, or remove one unnecessary frustration from your day. For Americans, these things are so deeply built into everyday life that they are easy to take for granted. For Europeans who experienced them temporarily, however, the difference became clearest only after returning home. They had come to America expecting to miss the landmarks when they left. Instead, some found themselves missing the air conditioning at a gas station, the crushed ice in an ordinary drink, or the ability to get almost anything they needed without reorganizing their entire day. It was a strange realization. America had not simply shown them more comfort. It had quietly changed their definition of what everyday life should feel like. For many Europeans, understanding the true size of America was almost impossible until they actually experienced it. Looking at a map was one thing. Spending hours driving through a single state and realizing they were still nowhere near the other side was something entirely different. Everything seemed to operate on a scale that challenged their sense of what was normal. Highways stretched toward horizons that never seemed to get closer. Parking lots looked large enough to hold entire neighborhoods. Supermarkets required more walking than some European town centers, and pickup trucks towered over the compact cars many visitors were used to driving back home. At first, the size of everything became an easy joke. Why did anyone need a truck that large? Why did a grocery store need 40 different versions of the same product? Why did people drive such enormous distances as though they were going around the corner? Then slowly, the scale began to feel less ridiculous. On an American road trip, driving for several hours could still leave you inside the same state, yet the landscape might completely transform around you. Mountains disappeared into deserts, forests opened into enormous plains, and lakes could stretch so far beyond the horizon that European visitors initially mistook them for the ocean. America wasn't simply large on a map. Its size changed the way people experienced movement, distance, and possibility. That sense of scale extended into everyday life. Wide roads made large vehicles feel natural rather than absurd. Homes often had more room. Stores carried an almost overwhelming amount of choice. And even ordinary entertainment venues could feel enormous. Visitors who once criticized America for making everything unnecessarily big sometimes found themselves becoming surprisingly comfortable with having space around them. The real contrast appeared after they returned home. The same narrow streets and compact spaces they had known their entire lives had not become any smaller. But after weeks surrounded by America's openness, they could suddenly feel different. Roads required more careful maneuvering. Parking spaces felt tighter. Stores seem more limited, and journeys that once felt perfectly normal could begin to feel strangely confined. This wasn't necessarily because one way of living was better than the other. Europe's compact cities make walking easier and place centuries of history within remarkably small areas. But America had introduced these visitors to something they rarely experienced at home: the feeling that there was always more space ahead. Perhaps that is why even the long distances many Europeans initially complained about became part of what they remembered most. In America, 4 hours on the road could feel less like wasted time and more like an invitation to see how dramatically the world could change beyond the next horizon. And once you become accustomed to that sense of openness, returning to a smaller world can create an unexpected feeling of confinement. Many Europeans arrived believing America's obsession with size was simply another example of excess. They laughed at the trucks, questioned the highways, and stared in disbelief at stores large enough to get lost inside. But when they finally went home, some discovered that the strange thing wasn't how enormous America had felt while they were there. It was how much smaller everything else felt after they left. Perhaps the hardest thing Europeans brought home from America wasn't something packed inside their suitcases. It was the uncomfortable realization that, somewhere along the journey, they had begun to feel different themselves. America has a way of making its national identity impossible to ignore. Flags hang from homes and businesses without embarrassment. Entire communities gather for local celebrations. Strangers become friends around backyard barbecues, and people speak about their country with a confidence that can initially seem excessive to outsiders. For Europeans coming from cultures where open patriotism is often treated with greater caution, that energy can take some getting used to. Yet when visitors experience it from inside rather than judge it from a distance, something changes. They see families gathering, communities celebrating together, and strangers being welcomed into moments that were never designed for tourists. What once looked like loud American pride begins to feel more like belonging. And perhaps that feeling explains why going home could be so unexpectedly difficult. The streets they returned to were the same streets they had left, and their lives were waiting exactly where they had paused them. Yet after experiencing the openness, energy, and almost unapologetic optimism of America, familiar routines could suddenly feel smaller. Back home, ambitious ideas might once again be met with skepticism. Strangers returned to keeping their distance, and the quiet social rules they had followed their entire lives became more noticeable than before. America had not suddenly become perfect, and Europe had not suddenly become a bad place to live. The real change had happened inside the visitors themselves. For a few weeks, they had experienced a culture where enthusiasm rarely needed an apology, where talking to strangers was normal, where bigger ideas were often met with encouragement rather than immediate doubt, and where being openly excited about life didn't automatically make you look foolish. Then they had to leave. The ranch would eventually run out. The American snacks would disappear. The photos would slowly move further down the camera roll, and everyday life would return to normal. But the hardest thing to replace was the feeling America had given them while they were there. Perhaps that is why the words "I wish I never had to leave" carry more weight than simple vacation nostalgia. These Europeans were not only missing American food, wide roads, convenience, or friendly strangers. They were missing the version of everyday life they had briefly experienced, and in some cases, the more open and confident version of themselves that had appeared within it. They arrived expecting America to be too loud, too big, too excessive, and too different from everything they considered normal. Yet somewhere along the way, those same qualities became part of what made leaving so difficult. And when the plane finally carried them back across the Atlantic, they took their luggage home with them. But the American life they had grown to love stayed behind. So if you've ever returned home from America and found yourself missing something you never expected to miss, tell us what it was in the comments. And if there's one part of American life you believe the rest of the world doesn't truly understand until they experience it for themselves, we'd love to hear that too.